On June the 22nd, 1941, Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union. Throughout the campaign, the German ground forces, namely the Heer, relied on rail transport to move supplies to the four distribution centers, where the supplies were then loaded onto vehicles and delivered to the front. Therefore, it was vital that the German army secure, repurpose, and exploit the Soviet rail network. However, the Soviet rail network used a wider gauge of 5 feet, whereas Germany and most of Europe used 4.85 feet or 1.435 meters. In addition, the rail network was less dense compared to Germany and Western Europe. It was reported that in 1938, the USSR had on average 0.65 miles of rail per 100 square miles, versus 20 miles of rail per 100 square miles in Germany that same year. Even adjusted for the sheer size of Russia, the Soviets had 3.3 miles of rail per 10,000 population, versus 5.8 in Germany. To address the issue of the wider railroad gauge in the USSR, the Germans immediately began converting the wide gauge track to standard gauge at the onset of the invasion. It was determined that this course of action would be more viable in the long term than reloading supplies onto wide-gauge trains or employing adjustable axles. A post-war analysis determined that it would take no longer than 20 days for 1,000 crews of 30 men each to convert the 25,000 kilometers of rail that the Germans used in 1941, resulting in negligible delay for supply transport if done over the course of the operation. According to Chief of Staff Franz Halder, the Germans could do it twice as fast with the same aforementioned manpower and resources, as a 200-man railway battalion could convert 20 kilometers of rail daily. For Army Group North, narrow-gauge rail in the Baltic states had to be converted to standard gauge. However, as the front line rapidly progressed eastward and well beyond the extent of converted rail, German ground forces captured hundreds of Soviet train cars and locomotives, appropriating them for use on the unconverted wide-gauge railroads. As a result, the conversions of certain stretches of railroad were either delayed or completed gradually in order to preserve the smooth flow of supplies eastward. Another advantage of retaining the unconverted wide-gauge rail was the greater capacity of the captured wide-gauge railroad cars. In addition, Soviet locomotives had greater water capacity, which was necessary to operate in areas where water stations and other service facilities were far and few in between, an all too common situation in the Soviet Union. The German locomotives, on the other hand, could not use the low-quality coal abandoned by the Soviets unless it was doused in petrol or combined with German coal. The rate of conversion had been disappointing since the very start of the campaign because the Eisenbahntruppe, the railroad troops, lacked motorized vehicles and had low priority for fuel, equipment, and manpower. In July 1941, they had to be supplemented by personnel from the Reichsbahn. According to Halder, by August 2nd, the primary reason for the inadequacy of rail transport was the shortage of captured Soviet train cars. This means the Germans were still relying on both the existing wide-gauge rail network and the converted standard-gauge rail network. Many railroads in European Russia lacked crushed rock ballast and instead used sand and gravel. Crushed rock ballast was ideal to form a firm base to prevent sliding of rails and railroad ties, block vegetation, and facilitate drainage. Railroad bridges were not safe by German standards and never supported double-tracked railroads. Instead, double-tracked railroads would split up into two single-track railroads 50 to 100 yards apart over river crossings. Russian demolition of rail bridges, repair shops, and critical railroad facilities such as shunting yards and other service stations significantly hindered German efforts to restore and operate rail transport. Come winter, these problems were compounded when German locomotives suffered technical failures. Coupled with partisan attacks, German forces expended significant manpower and material to prevent delays and secure the rail network. At the onset of Operation Barbarossa, Eisenbahntruppe moved ahead of the main advance and began conversion of the railroad to standard gauge, even in areas that had not yet been seized and secured by advancing German divisions. However, they focused on building more standard gauge rail and converting broad gauge to standard gauge while paying little to no attention to features such as quays, train workshops, locomotive sheds, and coal dumps. Army Group North, for example, captured over 180 broad gauge train cars and locomotives east of the Dvina River and operated them on the unconverted broad gauge railroads. It was not until September of 1941 that Army Group North stockpiled supplies in advance and temporarily halted rail transport to allow for the gauge conversion of the railroad running from Pskov to Leningrad. By the 21st of October 1941, Army Group North had laid 4,200 miles of standard gauge track and converted 3,750 miles of narrow gauge rail in the Baltic states to standard gauge. The supply situation for Army Group North became favorable due to the rapid conversion of the rail network to standard gauge, the usage of Baltic ports to open sea shipping, the usage of improvised supply convoys over Lake Peipus, the capture of existing trains, German attempts to seize rail bridges intact, rapid reconstruction and repair of Russian rail bridges, and the availability of local labor in the Baltic states collaborating for railroad construction. On the contrary, the supply situation for Army Group South at the onset of Operation Case Blue was viewed as catastrophic. Forces advancing toward the Caucasus and Stalingrad would be supplied by the 600-mile-long railroad running southeast from Rostov to Baku, a 300-mile-long single-track railroad running northeast from the Don Basin directly to Stalingrad, and another railroad running northeast from Salsk to Stalingrad. This would create a bottleneck at the main line running from Mariupol, Ukraine, to Rostov, which had been temporarily put out of action by Soviet demolition. The single-track railway supporting the German forces could only run a maximum of 12 trains per day, including the trains needed to transport personnel and material to maintain and improve the railways. As a result, the Wehrmacht chief of transportation protested against Operation Case Blue, claiming that it was impossible to supply both halves of Army Group South, which were Army Group B advancing toward the Volga and Stalingrad, and Army Group A advancing toward the Caucasus. By 1943, the rail transport network was able to meet the demands of the army groups without major issues due to the extensive renovation and construction of the rail network in the previous 2 years.